I hope in the time I'm talking to you that I can persuade you that not only is going smoke-free the right thing to do, but it's quite achievable. When I was getting the taxi to the airport this morning, I was chatting to the taxi driver, a young Pakistani man who has been in the UK for 5 years, but in Pakistan was actually a lawyer. And I was telling him why I was coming. And he told me the story of how when he was a student, he was living in student accommodation with some very close friends, people he'd been friends with for a long time. And he's a smoker. And he realized that the other people in the flat, mostly, including his very close friend, were non-smokers. So he suddenly thought, actually, what I'm doing to them is wrong. He said, for religious reasons, I felt I was potentially harming their health, and actually created in his student flat a smoking area and persuaded the other smokers in the accommodation to use this as well as himself in order to protect people. The other thing is that I've got a 59-year history as a smoker, but I've never smoked a cigarette in my life. Now, it's not a difficult conundrum because, of course, I've been a passive smoker for all of that time. Both of my parents smoked, and then when I went into psychiatry, of course, smoking was endemic in psychiatry, with something over 75% of all psychiatric patients smoking, and well over 65% of all psychiatric staff smoking. So I would always come home absolutely reeking of tobacco. That was one of the first things that persuaded me to stop wearing suede jackets, because they particularly actually hold the smell of smoking. And it's only in the last 7 years that I've been able to go to work and come home from a completely smoke-free environment. So I'm going to cover the context, the reasons for going smoke-free, method, outcomes, lessons learned 7 years on, and a conclusion from my own organisation. I call it my own organisation because although I retired from my substantive post at the end of March, I'm actually doing a locum back in the trust at the moment. Nottinghamshire Healthcare NHS Trust is the largest integrated mental health and community trust in the UK. The trust is going to have 3 operational divisions, and Health Partnerships provides community health services to the whole of Nottinghamshire. That includes district nursing, midwifery, children's services. Local Services provides mental health and learning disability services to all of Nottinghamshire and some of Leicestershire to people of all ages. And the Forensic Division provided high, medium and low secure beds, community services and offender health services. The Trust has a budget of £450 million and employs 9,000 staff. It's a big organisation. And it covers the whole of Nottinghamshire, which is the green bit in the middle. Our main centres are Duncombe at Millen House, our Trust headquarters. We have another unit, several other units in Nottingham. We go up to Mansfield, up to Bassetlaw, and then we have units, Wathwood Hospital and Arnold Lodge, which are the 2 medium secure units, which are actually outside of Nottinghamshire, and we'll come back to that. At the time of going smoke-free, the Trust had just the 2 divisions, forensic and local services, but was still the second largest mental health provider in the UK, and the largest provider of forensic services, not just in the UK, but actually in Europe. The Trust then had a budget of 300 million and 6,000 staff. The Trust operates in a range of sites, and the pictures are just to give a flavour of that. We operate in acute hospital sites. This is the Queen's Medical Centre, which is the largest acute hospital in Nottinghamshire. We operate from new build psychiatric facilities. Happens to be the front of Rampton, but it could be any one of many psychiatric facilities that we operate out of. And we operate out of old Victorian asylums. That's the old Mapley Hospital, which is now our Trust headquarters. The Trust actually operates, or the mental health and learning disability part of it operates on over 140 different sites across Nottinghamshire and neighbouring counties, including hospital, community, residential and community team bases. So it's got a whole variety of different services, and I'm emphasising that because I want to talk to you about how we took the whole trust into a smoke-free environment, not just the secure services. Offender health services are provided currently into 12 prisons, but it's going up to 14 from the beginning of October, providing largely integrated healthcare, that's all of the healthcare services into the prisons, and makes the Trust the largest provider of offender health services in the UK. And community services are provided to a forensic population in Nottinghamshire and personality disorder services to both offender and non-offender populations. So the low secure beds are provided predominantly for Nottinghamshire residents. That's the low secure unit within the trees. And you can actually see the old Mapley Hospital up above it. I think it's quite interesting actually in terms of the space it covers. The Wells Road Centre, which is the low secure unit, holds about 85 people. The old Mapley Hospital, which is on slightly less footprint actually of land, at one point accommodated 1,300, so we are fairly land hungry. The medium secure units are provided at Wathwood Hospital in South Yorkshire and at Arnold Lodge in Leicestershire. And high secure services are provided from Rampton Hospital in North Nottinghamshire. And to give you, I want you to just look at this slide because there's a couple of interesting points affecting the smoke-free policy in it. First of all, to give you an idea of the scale, the scale within the fence is about 100 acres. It's a big site. And there's about another 100 acres outside of a fence, including a village. And you've got to bear in mind the village because the village is on hospital land when I talk about some of the issues about going smoke-free. And the fence alone cost £25 million, so it's a very big and secure fence, and it takes staff a long time to get in and out of the hospital if they want to smoke, and I think that's again a feature, or if they want to do anything. The English and Welsh Departments of Health decided in 2006 that the whole of the NHS should become smoke-free by the 1st of April 2007. A decision was made later after concerns were raised by mental health providers that mental health services would not need to become smoke-free until June 2008. They were given an extra 14 months to go through the process of becoming smoke-free. Our Trust's journey to become smoke-free actually started in 2003 with an agreement with our staff-side organisations to make it possible for staff to only smoke outside of the buildings and then only in designated areas. Now, the immediate response from my staff at Rampton, the high secure unit, was that we had 2 claims from staff that they were getting smoking-related health problems from patients smoking. We'd never had such claims before, but once we challenged the staff not to be able to smoke inside the building, we got those claims. So we responded by putting smoking rooms or pods in every ward and day area at significant expense in the forensic services and most of the wards in the local services of the Trust. However, in the annual Healthcare Commission report in 2006, that's the precursor of the CQC, the Care Quality Commission, whilst I was the acting chief executive, we dropped a rating on 3 issues. One of which was that we had not got a comprehensive smoking policy. Even though we had a pretty comprehensive smoking plan, our policy didn't match up to it. The acting Trust Board team was really quite stung by this, and with the instructions coming from the Department of Health that the whole NHS should become smoke-free by the 1st of April 2007, we debated whether we should go with this. Our then Trust Chair, who was a very senior career NHS director, was very strongly in favour of going smoke-free and had been for quite a long time. Initially, I was reluctant, believing that it was wrong to take yet another freedom away from patients, many of whom were detained in hospital. But I was swayed on that point by our then nurse director, with who I'd worked with him for nearly 30 years, that in reality we actually stopped patients drinking, and we stopped them taking drugs when they came into our unit. So was actually stopping them smoking such a big step? We had a key advantage in that one of our high secure consultant psychiatrists, who had a strong interest in physical health care for patients with mental health problems, was absolutely passionate about the issue. And she agreed to persuade the medical staff across the Trust as long as I would actually take on persuading the trust board and the rest of the staff in the trust that we should go smoke-free. We set up a smoke-free group across the trust, chaired by our new nurse director, with support from the associate medical director in the forensic services and a senior nurse from local services. We put in full-time support, actually at a very senior level, with corporate associate director, who was also a psychiatric nurse, to the nurse director. And we put in place a project manager with support from a senior colleague in each division. We had a trust-wide smoke-free project group, chaired by the Director of Nursing, and divisional groups that fed into this. And we used very strict Prince 2 project management methodology to actually become smoke-free. We put in place a smoke-free policy that stopped all smoking in the buildings and grounds and staff, and that is right across the trust. That's not just in the secure units, that's in our local services, our community team bases. It was a complete ban on smoking buildings and grounds. We had just 2 exemptions for patients, either that they had a terminal illness or an acute exacerbation of a chronic mental illness. Now, 7 years on, we've never actually used either of those exemptions. But to some extent, we put the exemptions in because we needed to for legal reasons. We were very clearly advised if we had no exemptions, we would probably lose in court. We allowed smoking just inside our boundaries and provided ashtrays for staff and patients so as not to litter the local community. I had quite an interesting discussion with your team here about this issue. We did this because we wanted our campuses smoke-free, but equally we recognised that our campuses were in the community. People lived next door to our units. There were schools opposite or next door to our units. Actually having our staff standing out in the street smoking outside of other people's houses was fairly undesirable and actually led to complaints. So we compromised. We put an ashtray just inside our boundaries, and the staff were to smoke just inside the boundaries, putting their cigarette ends in the bins on our ground where we were responsible for emptying them. We closed all of the smoke rooms and pods on the wards and planned and budgeted to remove and reuse those areas. I have to say we weren't able to remove and reuse them for several years afterwards because we were going through a court case both at all 3 levels of courts in the UK, in the court, in the appeal court, and then in the Supreme Court. We agreed that patients could have nicotine replacement. And we also agreed to allow any member of staff who required it to have up to 2 courses of nicotine replacement in the year after the introduction of the policy. It's quite interesting, not a single member of staff actually took up that offer. And we have extended it, and probably over 7 years, a very tiny number of staff have actually taken up the offer. All the areas of the trust, but particularly the forensic areas, put in place elaborate plans to cope with patient difficulties over the cessation period, the immediate point when we went smoke-free. These included additional activities to keep people busy, special diets, fruit on every ward. There were just fruit bowls available to patients to grab hold of if they felt they needed something in their hand. We put in place increased staffing levels for the first month. The consultants in the high and medium secure units made it clear that they wouldn't exempt people because to do so would mean putting in their notes that it was reasonable or beneficial for patients to smoke. And they suspected, and probably rightly, because every patient in the secure units is represented by a solicitor, that at some point one of them would sue for a smoking-related disease. We trained a large number of our staff in smoking cessation, offering levels 1, 2 and 3 courses, but with a trust-wide target, which we strictly policed, of having 50% of all clinical staff trained to level 1, the highest level. When the Department of Health decided to shift the date for mental health trust by 15 months, we debated whether to go with this, but decided that as we'd already progressed our plan over the previous 12 months, and I emphasise that because we spent a long time putting in place the plans of what we were going to do on the 1st of April, or midnight on the 31st of March 2007. We'd spent 12 months planning that, and the staff and the patients were all geared up to the original date. Many of the patients actually stopped smoking before the date because they knew it was coming. And we felt, therefore, we should stick to the earlier date. There was a lot of anxiety from staff and indeed from patients. There would be a lot of violent incidents, particularly in the high and medium secure units, when we introduced the policy, if not a full-blown riot. And I don't exaggerate when I say the staff were really concerned that we would have a riot on our hands. We might then ask why we decided to go for a full rather than a partial ban. This is a quote from Rini Cormack and Dr. McNally in Advances in Psychiatric Treatment. Basically, I won't bore you with going through the things, it's in your packs, but essentially a total ban is simpler to manage. It's actually simpler to implement, it's simpler to police, it works more effectively, it gives you one or two extra problems, but overall it is actually an easier thing to do. So these are some comments from staff and then from patients about it on breaches of policy. Yes, I am turning a blind eye on occasions if this is awful, but it's very discreet and it's out of the way. Everybody else isn't in danger. I might just walk past. However, most people do say, put that out, please, and leave it at that. If they don't put it out because they don't want to escalate the situation. That was from a smoker. On the policy, we're just bullying them into not smoking. We're just enforcing government policy for the sake of it, with no benefit for the patients, staff, or the mental health service. That's an interesting one, isn't it? Particularly when you hear the research that actually we know that patients with serious psychiatric difficulties die on average 20 years younger than the general population, and the majority of that is from smoking-related diseases. So it's a huge, huge issue. On training, I'm quite lucky because I've done a little bit on smoking. I'm not a genius on it, but I've done a bit. But no, if somebody stood out there with withdrawal from nicotine, it would be classed, because they're in a mental health ward, as illness. That was from a smoker. On the ethics, they're poorly, and they're going through enough as it is. For them to have to stop smoking as well is even more traumatic. It's a big thing anyway for someone to stop smoking. I always say, because we've got a lady now that wants to stop smoking, I always say you need to get yourself right before you can stop smoking. You need to walk before you can run, sort of thing, not to do everything at once. And again, reflect back on the slides we've just seen. On the research on this, would say it's just the opposite, that stopping people smoking is helpful to their treatment. At Rampton, we had only approximately 3 additional incidents in the month after the smoke-free environment came in. And before somebody asked me the question, that's on the basis of around 100 serious incidents a month. So it's a tiny, tiny increase. And actually, we just opened the new women's unit at the same time, so we're not sure whether the increase in incidents in that first month came from moving the women patients, who are actually some of the most challenging at Rampton, into their new unit, or going smoke-free. In local services, we had a similar number, and in the regional secure units, the 2 medium secure units, we had no additional incidents at all. 5 patients at Rampton took us and the Secretary of State to judicial review, but interestingly, none of these patients had asked for an exemption. We won both the original court case and the appeal. The basis of the claims were on Article 8 of the Human Rights legislation, the right to a home life. Our defence was on the basis that they were patients in hospital for treatment. And also we maintain that having smoking in the grounds would either expose staff to passive smoking or create an unsafe environment if they weren't staffed. Lord Justice Pill said this is in the judgment, there's very strong evidence that smoking causes disease and endangers the health of the smokers themselves and other people who live and work in their vicinity. And at the bottom it says, like other hospitals, it is smoke-free. Both health and security considerations justify the ban, even though smoking in the grounds, which may be possible at other hospitals, is not feasible at Rampton. In high and medium secure services, we've had a completely smoke-free environment now for over 7 years, and it's dramatically more pleasant. And I want to say that in local services and community forensic, we struggled more than in the high and medium secure, and I'm going to come back to that. The number of staff in high and medium secure who go for smoking breaks, and we can actually measure that in both units because they've got to go out through the entrance. We can actually be very clear who's going out. Has fallen to about 20 in Rampton, and that's where there are 2,000 staff, so it's a tiny number. The number of staff smoking in local services has dropped, but not as dramatically. We had to allow some exemptions in local services in all areas in the grounds, but none in the buildings. So our buildings are and remain entirely smoke-free. The issue around the grounds, I'm going to come back to, because there's a very, very specific issue there, and even though we wanted to continue with a completely smoke-free campus, we felt we had to allow this particular exemption. And our addiction services have been a particular problem. And at the time, until very recently, they were in the same building as the Community Forensic and Low Secure Service. So, again, comments. Post-implementation. Once the smoke-free policy was implemented, there was nothing. I felt, why do all this? Then what? Then what do we do with them? Where's the plan after the implementation? Other comments I've heard are very scathing about the reputation damage of smokers being seen on the outskirts of our sites. There's a feeling that we should be more lenient in the grounds. I think the buildings are not a problem for staff. No one misses that. Actually, I want to come back. I just want to comment, and I found it interesting, the line taken in Ireland, which in many ways I prefer, because we've had a big argument with our commissioners for our medium secure services, because we went completely smoke-free. And the commissioners commission all the medium secure services, some 60% of which in England and Wales are provided in the independent sector, not in the NHS. And quite a few of the independent sector units were still allowing smoking and getting positive reflection from the patients. And the commissioners were allowing them to get away with it. And it was costing us money. Leave aside the £300,000 it cost me in our legal budget to actually pay for the defence of this. So we had quite an argument with the commissioners nationally over why they were doing that, when there was an NHS policy that you should be completely smoke-free in buildings and grounds, and that they were still commissioning services from services, private sector services that had smoking. I think the buildings are not a problem for staff. No one misses that. This is from staff. Smoke-free policy has helped me stop smoking. Thank you. I used to smoke for 40 years. I've quit for 1 year. My breathing is getting slightly better. It's the first time I've thought of myself as a non-smoker. It's a good feeling. Smokers have far less fag breaks. It's much fairer on other staff. What an improvement. No more scruffy, debris-filled smoke huts. No smokers now doing a full day's work like non-smokers. The only welcome change to happen at Rampton in many years. I love it. Improved air quality throughout the organisation. For once in my life, everyone is working a full shift instead of non-smokers carrying the smokers. You can get the essence of the theme there, really, can't you? I don't smoke, I never have done, nor will. I'm pleased I work in a non-smoking environment. It's the best thing since sliced bread. And from the patients, I feel that it has and is of great benefit to all concerned who live here that the environment is smoke-free. I found it easy to quit smoking because everybody had to quit at the same time. A much cleaner villa, and you can sit near anyone and not smell the smoke. Very little drama from the former smokers on cold turkey, thanks to the excellence of leadership, staff and responsibility. I feel much better physically, and I know I shouldn't smoke, but I'm absolutely dying for a fag. And I think we've got to recognise that last bit, actually, because for people who've been addicted to tobacco, that is often a very long-standing problem for them after they stop smoking. I think one of the things I found interesting is one of the patients who took us to court and was very, very verbose. He was in the dangerous and severe personality disorder unit at Rampton. He was angling to go back to prison. He was pushing very hard to go back to prison so that he could smoke again in prison. And eventually, after we'd been smoke-free for about 2 years, he actually got back to prison, and he didn't smoke, interestingly, having pushed for the I suppose in a way he wanted the battle at the legal battle, but having been smoke-free for 2 years, he didn't go back to it. So, what are the lessons learned? And some of these will reflect back to the research evidence. We underestimated the impact on the substance misuse services, and I think it's best emphasised for me by my colleague, my consultant psychiatrist colleague who ran the substance misuse service at the time. He had gone smoke-free like the rest of the trust. He had taken the policy, they'd worked very hard on it, and he came to me really quite distressed. He said, "What do you want me to do?" We have a contract with the commissioners that says we've got to get a certain number of people in to get them off their opiates, to get rid of their opiate dependence. It's an inpatient unit. People come in on a voluntary basis, and the patients are saying to me, I can't cope with coming off my opiates and coming off tobacco at the same time. Not just the nicotine, but the tobacco at the same time. And they had tried to find a way around it, because these were voluntary patients, of taking them off the ward, out of the unit and off the site, which actually, strictly speaking, then didn't breach the policy, but they didn't have enough staff to do that. So either we could have given them a lot more staff, which we couldn't afford on the basis of the contracts, or we had to find another solution. We need to rethink the needs of acute psychiatric admissions, and I just raise that, not because I don't think you should be smoke-free, because I absolutely do think you not just should be, but can be smoke-free. But people coming in acutely who are heavy smokers, you need to do something to help them immediately they come in. You need to give them particularly nicotine replacement straight away. And you need to be conscious that for a lot of them, they'll start smoking again when they go out of hospital. So don't be unrealistic. However well trained your staff are, however much they push the message, a lot of those patients will go back out and smoke, particularly if they've only got something like a 1 or 2 week stay in hospital. We underestimated the effect on the medium and low secure patients as they started to take unescorted leave, and that goes back to the issue about clozapine. Very interesting. We hadn't taken that into account. Now, bear in mind, this is 2007. It's long before 2013, because what we found was, as the patients started taking unescorted leave out of the medium secure units, many of them started smoking again. That led to two things. One, it led to a covert behaviour where they were hiding cigarettes and their ignition materials. And we actually had to find a solution to that. So in the end, we did the easy, pragmatic thing. We gave them a locker just outside the entrance, which they had the key to, and they could store their smoking materials. So when they went out on unescorted leave, they could collect their cigarettes and their ignition materials and take them on a walk. But the thing we did find is that some of our patients started becoming psychotic again. And the reason they became psychotic is they'd started to smoke and their clozapine levels dropped. And quite a few of them were on clozapine. So we actually had to much more closely monitor the clozapine levels of people as they started taking leave, and to manage their dose by pushing their dose back up again while they were out of the hospital. So it's a word of caution, really. We had to learn to be realistic in providing safe storage. I said that. And we need to take account of the impact of nicotine on blood levels of various antipsychotic drugs, but particularly clozapine and olanzapine, but it isn't just those. We found we had to put a lot of pressure on a small number of senior staff who were very heavy smokers, and I remember having to personally go and take to task 2 of our culture carriers in our local services who continued to smoke quite heavily just outside the grounds. So strictly speaking, they were within the policy, but they were quite obvious to more junior members of staff, and I wanted to make them realise the impact they were having in terms of being an example. And you should never underestimate the ability of senior medical staff to try to sabotage plans that they don't support or they haven't thought of. You need to take them along with you. It's really, really important, because they can sabotage what you're doing. And I think particularly, I've put in a little note here actually, particularly rehab consultants, interestingly. And I'll tell you why rehab consultants, because rehab consultants have a model of empowerment. They actually believe that we should be re-empowering patients, many of whom have been disempowered by the psychiatric system, and put them on the recovery model. And that means giving them control back for their lives. And actually, it is quite difficult how you square that with quite a rigid stopping people smoking, but you have to have that rigid policy or it doesn't work. So that's difficult. I underestimated the impact of a change of trust chair, because just at the point we were going smoke-free, it was just a month before, our trust chair retired and was replaced by another trust chair. Now, our new trust chair was a professor of medical epidemiology, in fact was the head of the Department of Health Mental Health Research Programme. So she had a huge knowledge of this, but she came and said to me, exactly that point, is this reasonable that we're putting more controls on psychiatric patients? And isn't there evidence that actually they get more irritable and disturbed when you stop them smoking. And I had to, it was quite good, I was able to give her the evidence and say, actually the evidence is they get less disturbed and less anxious, and we have less incidents in security when people aren't smoking than when they are. So with that, she went along with it. And I put this one in, this is not a bit of bitterness, but I also underestimated the impact of a new chief executive for whom the smoke-free plan was already in existence. It wasn't his plan, it was my plan. I'd been the acting CEO for 2 years when we went through this. New chief executive came in, wasn't his plan, he wasn't really very interested in it, he wasn't prepared to push it in the same way that I had. And that certainly had an impact, and I'm raising this because I think you do need to continue to be very firm about keeping the control. So in the forensic part of our trust, it's rigidly controlled because that was the bit I ran, and my successor in post is somebody who'd worked for me and I think has a very similar view. In the other parts of the trust, it's not as well controlled or policed because it doesn't have quite the same zealotry that I felt. We didn't properly take account of the fact that some patients who had community leave would secrete cigarettes and try to smoke under their covers, creating fire risks. This is a really important point in our acute units. And this is actually why we went back to having somewhere where people could smoke outside of the buildings and in the grounds, one place, so we could control it very closely. But it was a recognition that if we didn't do that, patients who had community leave could go to the shop, buy cigarettes and materials to light their cigarettes, and then they would bring them back in, and because we didn't allow smoking on the ward, we didn't allow smoking in the grounds, they were actually waiting until they got into bed, hid under the sheets and lit up. And we had actually 2 very serious fire incidents, one of which one in the Queen's Medical Centre, so it's a huge acute hospital with 1,000 acute beds over, I can't remember how many miles of corridor there are, but there's several hundred miles of corridors in the Queen's Medical Centre. It's enormous. And one in one of our own units. We've had to police illicit selling of tobacco and cigarettes, especially in the low secure service, and having allowed our substance misuse patients to smoke in the grounds, and for them the grounds were actually a courtyard in the middle of their ward. We didn't take into account of the impact on the low secure ward because the low secure ward was actually above their courtyard, and it had a nice funnel effect of the smoke came up from the ground floor and into the windows of the low secure unit, and of course caused a lot of tension in the low secure unit. And that was really only resolved when we moved the substance misuse service ward to a completely different site. We didn't fully take account of the impact on the community, and I raised that earlier, but for instance our low secure unit entrance was right opposite a school, and when we had the policy that staff had to smoke outside of our grounds, what was happening in the low secure units, they were going just outside the grounds, and it is literally right opposite a secondary school. Now, what sort of an example is that of a psychiatric hospital having staff smoking opposite a school? And you really, we had to think about it. I can't speak for you, but we felt we had to think about it and do something about it. And we could have just said, well, go and smoke at the other end of the hospital. If you go off the site, the other side of the hospital, but actually that took them over half an hour, which would take up more than their lunch break. So 7 years on, for high secure units, the smoke-free policy has been a complete success. The patient behaviours caused by recurrent nicotine withdrawal has ceased. There's no trading in tobacco or cigarettes. The fire risk has reduced. The environment is far better. Very few patients, except those immediately coming in from prisons, require nicotine replacement or want it. Allowing staff smoking in the grounds, not the grounds within the perimeter, so I'm not going to go back to the slide of Rampton, but just try and picture it again. You've got the hospital, you've got this huge perimeter fence, and then you've got a village outside of it. What we found was happening, it was quite interesting, because we did actually ban smoking completely from our building and grounds. With, again, right at the entrance, which took you nearly half an hour to get to from one of the wards. We only allowed smoking there. But what we found, because there's a village on our site, and quite a lot of the people who live in the village are owner-occupiers. They own their own houses. They bought them from the hospital over the years. One of the couples was offering their garden as a smoking area for staff. And they said, you can smoke in our garden, and they put up a shelter as well to make it feasible, and they had a charity box, and they said, you've got to give a contribution to charity if you smoke. And they raised several £1,000s for charity, I have to say, by doing that. Then one of the couple died, And we actually had to take on board, what do we do now? Because the reality was our staff had been smoking in that facility. Do we just ban it completely and go back to them having to walk to undergrounds, or do we compromise? And we did compromise. I rather reluctantly compromised, but my deputy felt we should do it, and I'd deputised to him running Rampton. We have one smoking shelter outside of the perimeter, but still in the grounds, and a very clear instruction that if it's left untidy, i.e. people don't stub their cigarettes out and put them in the bin, it will be closed. But the number of staff smoking has gone up since we've had that facility. It's an interesting reflection. So I don't think it was the right thing to do, but I'm not in charge anymore, so other people have to think about it. For the medium secure units, it's again been a huge success once we found ways to cope with the reality that patients do start smoking once they leave the site. For low secure services, it's been much better since the substance misuse service moved off-site, but we have had to take some very stiff action to ensure that we had the active support of all the senior staff, a small number of whom undermined the policy because of the ethical dilemmas creating very real secure problems. And I go back to that, it was about this whole thing, should we empower the patients? We're trying to rehabilitate them, we're trying to get them out. And we actually had to make it very clear that they were creating a fire risk and a risk for everybody else in the building. It's important to accept that for short admissions, most patients who smoke will continue to smoke on discharge, and you need to take account of their needs for nicotine, because it's disruptive and also potentially dangerous because of the impact on their drug levels. And I don't think that means there doesn't still need to be a very active smoking awareness and cessation course for patients when they're in hospital. I think there should. I think every patient you can get off smoking, you're improving their health and you're improving their chance of recovery. We do still provide nicotine replacement to staff. We decided it was actually costing so little because so few people took it up, we might as well continue it. Staff smoking is an issue, especially operating on hosted sites. It may well be that staff are taking their breaks on the wards to help with cover. When they're short staffing, and a walk right off the hospital grounds will take perhaps 30 minutes. In Rampton, we coped with that. This is at night particularly, where we had very low staffing levels in a high secure hospital, and the staff had to take their breaks on the wards. So we actually coped with it by giving them paid breaks. And I gather that's something you do in Ireland in any case, but we don't in most of the UK. So we paid for their breaks. We gave them an option. You said you can either have your half hour paid for, or you can keep it as your own, in which case you can still go out off-site to smoke. They all took the paid break, and because we were paying for it, we were able to legislate and say, in that case you don't smoke. It's our time. We're paying you to do it. That isn't the same in other parts of our trust. And again, we do have areas, particularly older people services, where very, very short-staffed at night. What do you actually do about staff who feel they need a cigarette and they really can't leave the ward, or they can't leave the vicinity of the ward because there may only be two staff on the ward? I'm not giving you the solution, but I'm just telling you it's something you need to think through. We have considered the use of e-cigarettes. We actively considered it at the Trust Board, and we decided to ban those as well. The reason we went for that is, A, there's no evidence currently that e-cigarettes are any safer than actual cigarettes. We may get evidence later, but at the moment there's no evidence to suggest that. And B, it's a practical one. If in the grounds of a hospital or a ward you've got somebody smoking an e-cigarette and there's vapour coming up, how are you going to know whether they're smoking a real cigarette or an e-cigarette? And we decided that was too risky, and we wanted to continue with the ban. So, in conclusion, going smoke-free is absolutely the right thing to do. You need to be clear that you're intent on creating a smoke-free environment, not trying to stop people smoking. You are trying to encourage people and educate people to stop smoking at the same time, but what you're actually trying to do is create a smoke-free environment in which there's no passive smoking. Educating people is integral but separate, and that's coming back to the thing. And this is my comment, and I know it caused your organisers a certain amount of concern, but I say you need to be sure that zealotry doesn't win out. I'm quite a zealot, and controlled pragmatism is the answer. And you've got some of the pragmatic solutions we came up with, which were very, very minor adjustments, but they enabled us to go through with the policy, like having your smoking bin just inside our own grounds and saying to staff, you smoke just inside the perimeter, not just outside it, which gets around the problem with your neighbours. Consider the reality of people's lives and consider your neighbours. However, overall the benefits on the environment and on secondary smoking are so great that this absolutely has to be done. One of my consultant colleagues said on my retirement this is probably the most important change I'd made during my career and would have the most long-term benefit on our patients. And when I reflected on that, and I've done quite a lot of different things in my career, I think he was absolutely right. I think long-term this is the most important. And I just put these 3 photographs up because these were buildings we put up after we'd gone smoke-free. And it enabled us to plan without any need for smoking facilities in the environment, and knowing that the actual environment would remain intact for a lot longer. These are all 3 are from the National High Secure Learning Disability Unit. That's the day therapy area, that's the inside of one of the wards, and that's one of the bedrooms. They're very high quality buildings. And we now know, because we haven't got smoking in those buildings, that they will remain high quality for a lot longer. So thank you very much.